Well, hello, everybody. This is Rob Hopkins, and it's a real pleasure to have been asked to speak at the Possible Futures Conference 2022. It's Possible Futures is something that I dedicate a lot of my time and energy to thinking about. So I want to show you some pictures. So I'm just going to do this because I want to be able to show you some images. So I'm Rob Hopkins. I'm speaking to you from the southwest of England, and I'm one of the people who founded the Transition Town movement. And more recently, a lot of my work is really focused around imagination, the importance of imagination, in particular, the importance of imagining the future in a different way. So I want to just start by telling you a little story about the moon. So in 1865, Jules Verne wrote a book called From the Earth to the Moon. And From the Earth to the Moon pulled together all the best science he could find about how we might actually go to the moon. And he wrote a thrilling, exciting story about people going to the moon. And we now know that some of the science he got right, some of it he really didn't get right. His way of getting the rocket to the moon was to fire it out of a 300-meter long cannon. And we now know that the force that would generate would reduce the astronauts to something very similar to jam in a split second. But it was a story which captured the imagination of engineers and scientists who started thinking, right, okay, how are we going to do this? How could this actually work, that we could actually make this happen? And so there started then to be this kind of crossover between artists, storytellers, scientists. This was the very first science fiction film ever made, 1902, Georges Méliès, which was about a voyage to the moon. Then we had this whole genre of popular science, of magazines and people speculating and engineers trying to design ways that we might actually go to the moon. How would it work? What would it actually look like? People started making films. There were many, many different films about going to the moon. Some of them were maybe not quite so sensible. This was a ridiculous film made in the 1950s called Cat Women of the Moon, where 6 male astronauts travel to the moon to discover the lost city of love-starved cat women. You've never seen anything like it, it says, and I think that's true. And it meant that, we also had Tintin went to the moon. We had songs. Frank Sinatra sang us to the moon. Everybody went to the moon. It was something that was deep in our culture. That longing had been created. That deep, deep desire to go to the moon had been created. And it meant that when Kennedy announced in 1962, we will go to the moon and we will do it before the end of the decade, it meant that we did it in 7 years from scratch, and the average age of the team of the people who figured out how to do it and made it happen was 26. And I found this cartoon recently which I loved. So that meant that when Neil Armstrong actually arrived on the moon, we'd already been there thousands and thousands of times in songs and stories and dances and comic books. So the storytelling goes first. The imagination goes first. When we want to make big changes and big shifts and achieve incredible things, it's the storytelling that creates the longing. The challenge we have now as a culture, we don't have 100 years to figure it out. It's far more urgent and far bigger challenge than going to the moon. This summer here in the UK, we saw temperatures about 3 degrees higher than we've ever had before. Across Europe, there was a massive heat wave. 100 towns in France ran out of water, and I'm sure you felt this where you are too. And climate change is not something that will happen in the future. It's happening now. And everything that we do determines how much worse it will get. And unless we act with incredible urgency, we will look back on this summer as having been one of the cool summers of this decade, of this century. And of course, while that was happening in Europe, in Pakistan, they had temperatures of above 50 degrees, followed by horrendous floods that inundated 30% of the country, 35 million people displaced. So this is here, it's now, it's happening, and it demands that we reimagine everything. And the Institute for the Future in America have this beautiful phrase on their window. It says, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. I love it. If the strategies you're coming up with to tackle climate change in your community, in your country, don't seem a bit ridiculous, they're probably not ambitious enough. So I'm really here in this talk to say, please be as ridiculous as you can. Please, this is a time for you to be really ridiculous and bold and brave and imaginative and extraordinary and creative, because anything else is really not enough. And this is a picture that I love from the United States from the mid-1960s, where when you went to the beach, you could just park your car on the beach. That's what everybody did. It meant that the beach looked like this, and that was the normal at the time. Shortly after this photograph was taken, something changed to say, let's not do that whole parking on the beach thing. And so it wasn't allowed anymore. And I think we would all agree now that going to the beach and it not being covered in cars is a really big improvement. But you can guarantee there will have been people who said, I can't imagine going to the beach and not parking my car on the beach. So the fact that people can't imagine something is no reason why we shouldn't do it. After all, this is in Brussels, in Belgium, where I was very recently. This is Grand Place in the 1960s. That's what it looked like then. That's what it looks like now. It's completely pedestrianized. It's one of the most popular parts of Brussels. But you can guarantee when it was like this, if one of the people you can see here had said, wouldn't this place be much nicer without any cars? That people would have said, oh, you're just a dreamer. It's ridiculous thing to imagine. But actually, things change and they change fast. And we need to be prepared for that, to live through a time where that happens. A couple of weeks ago, the United Nations wrote a report where they said 1.5 degrees is now no longer a possibility unless we are to see a rapid transformation of society. That was their quote, a rapid transformation of society. So all the newspapers all around the world led with front covers like this. Say goodbye to 1.5. Finished. Not possible. I didn't see any headlines that said, hey, let's have a radical transformation of society. That'd be cool. That sounds an awful lot better than saying goodbye to 1.5. But we tend very quickly to go to the well, it's too late, rather than really embracing the possibility of a rapid radical transformation of society. I think a radical transformation of society could be incredible. It's not like the current model is particularly working that well anyway. So what I try and do in the work that I do is to help people to really imagine, well, maybe we could do that radical transformation of society bit. That would be great. And I think one of the problems we have often in the movement, in the climate change movement, is that we don't allow ourselves to believe that we could actually be successful in doing that. This is the very famous climate stripes image, which is on the front cover of Greta Thunberg's new book. And the climate stripes every year shows the average temperature and shows how it's been increasing over time. If that is the flag, the banner of the movement that's trying to do something about it, I don't think it opens up any capacity for dreaming, for longing, for longing for a radical transformation of society. So I wonder if instead we might replace that with that. So we actually, as the Center for Artistic Activism in America put it, we imagine winning. Imagine winning. How different does our activism be if we put imagining winning at the heart of what it is that we do? I worry at the moment, though, that we are facing a terrible impoverishment of our imagination at the worst possible time. The time when we have to reimagine everything, our imagination muscle should be like this, and it's become a muscle like this. And this is a real problem. As Mariame Kaba, amazing activist in the United States, puts it, we live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. And this was research published in 2010, which said that IQ and imagination had risen together till the mid-90s, and then IQ had kept rising, imagination had started to fall. That's a real problem, because if we can only build something if we can imagine it first. So how can we cultivate longing for a low carbon, more just, fair, equal, delicious future? That's really what I want to talk to you about today, because we're only going to do this, we're only going to make the shift that physics demands that we make if it feels like an invitation to something irresistible and delicious and absolutely magnificent. If it feels like we are being dragged away from something completely irreplaceable, it's not going to happen. This has to be about how we bring this alive in people's sense of imagination and possibility, which is why the name of your festival appealed to me so much. This is an artist called James Mackay who draws the future. He said, what would our cities look like if they became the most biodiverse places they could be? Maybe they'd look like this. What if we took more and more cars out of our cities and turned those streets into gardens? We took up the concrete, the tarmac we saw in many cities this summer, that concrete and tarmac at temperatures over 40 degrees kill people. So how do we get rid of that and create cities that can breathe, can hold moisture? And how different would it be to live in a city like this? One of the challenges that we have is often that we walk through places like this, we think this is what it looks like, it's always going to look like this. Maybe this animation might help. I think we need to do a lot more things like that. Places that people recognize, they know really well. How do we take them and tweak them and adapt them and turn them into a future that we can dream of? When I look at this picture, I think, what's mental health like in that London? What work are people doing? How loud is the bird song in the morning in that London? So what I want to share with you today is something we call the imagination sundial. It came out of when I was writing a book called From What Is to What If, which is a book about imagination, came out a couple of years ago. And working with a guy called Rob Shorter, we created this. And it's our attempt to say, okay, if our imagination muscle is like this, it needs to be like this. How do we do that? How do we revitalize the collective imagination? So I want to go through each bit of it and tell you a few stories. The first one is space. You know that your imagination is at its most vibrant when it has space, not when you're stressed, anxious, overwhelmed. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came when he rode his bicycle in the forest. But those spaces are disappearing very quickly out of our lives, and we need to replace them. The organizations, the governments, the businesses around us, unless they intentionally create space to reimagine themselves, it's not going to happen. They're just going to carry on as they are. This is in my town where the community held a big imagining day. We do this kind of thing a lot. We think of it as a kind of what if space. We need to do a lot more of that. This is a story which I love about space in two ways, actually, from Zambia. So in 1964 in Zambia, while Russia and America were competing to put the first man on the moon, a man called Edward Makuka Unkoloso announced the Zambian space program. Said, no, actually, the first person on the moon is going to be from Zambia, be a young woman, and we're building a rocket. And this was how he trained his astronauts for weightlessness in space. He rolled them down a hill in an old oil drum. And he was also very ambitious. He was planning a trip to Mars, taking a missionary and some cats. And everybody said that this guy at the time was completely mad. And it didn't happen, as you probably noticed. But when he died in 1989, he was buried with the highest honors the Zambian government could give their citizens, because he opened a space in that newly independent nation to say, why shouldn't the first person on the moon be from Zambia? We can do anything. And most people had forgotten his story. And then a few years ago, a photographer called Christina Di Midel made a beautiful series of photographs that she called Afronauts, which kind of reinterpreted his story. And they're very beautiful, I think. So I think we need to hold on to that idea that space is something we have to make. We can't reimagine things without the intentional creation of space. Even in our own lives, it's like making regular space for having a yoga practice or a meditation practice or walking the dog or something. We need to make space for our imaginations as well. The second thing is place. And what I mean by place is a place that you go to, and afterwards, when you go home again, you see the place you've come from through new eyes. You see its possibilities in different ways. And these places are really important. This is in London on Waterloo Bridge, where in 2019, Extinction Rebellion closed this bridge for 2 weeks and turned it into a forest. They put trees all down the middle of it, and people would stop, who every day would normally walk over it when it was full of traffic, would stop and say, why can't it be like this all the time? You know, I like to think of it as being a pop-up tomorrow. How do you create pop-up tomorrows in the places where we live that allow us to glimpse into the possible futures that this festival is named after. I get to travel around and visit lots of different places where those stories are happening. This is a project I love in Marseille in the south of France, where McDonald's in the north of Marseille, very difficult neighborhood, lots of drugs and gangs and undocumented migrants and problems, poverty. And McDonald's, the French government paid McDonald's to open a McDonald's restaurant in this district. And after 5 years of paying them to run this, they said, well, I think you've had enough money now. So McDonald's closed it just before COVID, and everybody lost their jobs. But the guy who had been the manager still had the keys, and he reopened the building as a food bank, which during COVID fed 2,000 people a week, gave out 2,000 food parcels a week from this building. And it was such a success that the local council bought them this building, and they're now going to open it as a fast social food, is what they're calling it, a fast social food restaurant. And they're using that then as the catalyst for people starting to grow food around in this neighborhood. It's a really transformative and extraordinary project. And many people have been to visit this, and it's really changed their sense of what's possible. One of the projects that I do at the moment, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just for a second, because I'm aware that for this next bit, I need to share some sound. So I'm just going to do that. So then go back again. I'm doing a project called Field Recordings from the Future, where I go to visit places that already exist, which sound like the future we're talking about here needs to sound like. What would it sound like to live in a city with no cars? I imagine living in the middle of Rio. That's a pretty impossible thing to imagine, right? So I went to a place in Germany called Freiburg, where they have a neighborhood called the Vauban, which is the biggest car-free neighborhood in Germany, in Europe, actually. 3,000 people live here with no cars, amazing number of bicycles and pedestrian walkways and very ecological buildings. It's an amazing place. So this is a little recording that I made there. It's about a minute long. So you might like to close your eyes at this point and imagine that you are in the car-free Rio of the near future, or a city near where you live. And this is what it might sound like. So yeah, so I do a lot of that kind of thing, of visiting places where the future already exists, and I hope that was an enjoyable trip to the future for you. So the third thing is practices, and what I mean by practices is the things that we do together that help to exercise that imagination muscle. This is an amazing artist called Sun Ra, who played during the 60s, 70s, 80s, who told an amazing story about himself. He said, I'm not from this planet. I'm actually from Saturn. I'm an angel from Saturn, and with my band, we travel through space. And he wore incredible costumes like this, but like all the time. Like when he went to the shops or when he went to the laundrette, this wasn't like a stage persona. This is who he was. He once said, we've tried the possible and it failed. Now it's time to try the impossible. And I read a book about him recently that described him as an everyday utopian, which I thought was just beautiful. And I was reminded of him recently when I saw this T-shirt from the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington in 2020. I've been to the future, we won. I've been to the future, we won. So beautiful. I love that so much. It gave me goosebumps when I first heard it. How different would our activism be if that was the approach that we took? I've been to the future, we won. Every conversation that we had about climate change wasn't just about extinction and collapse. It was about what's the future that we could still create that we long for? How do we bring it alive for people? I want to hear what you long for. I long to live in a city where the rivers are so clean that people can swim to work. I long to live in a future where the bird song is louder than the traffic. I long to live in a city that measures its well-being by the number of children playing outside in the street. This is if we can bring this idea of I've been to the future we won into our activism and the way we work, I think it could be really transformative. This is a council in London who created somewhere they called Think and Do, working with the local community. They created an imagination space on the high street in an old cafe, gathering people's ideas, their stories, their sense of what's possible. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And one of the things they did was they gathered people's stories of what that 2030 would be like, and they created a version of their local newspaper they called the Camden Future Journal. That was a newspaper from 2030 of the stories. The poet Rilke once said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens," which is so beautiful. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. How do we find the ways to do that? How do we redesign our activism, our work, our storytelling to enable that? This is a picture I found recently from Munich, where they just were putting up posters to start people imagining those places differently. Imagine every parked car is a tree. What if the streets were blooming? How do we start to take space over? I was recently in France. I saw these posters on the underground about what if your money allowed you to put yourself back together, I think is what it means. But it's lovely to see this sort of what if messaging starting to come through, because I think the ability to ask really good what if questions is going to be central to our ability to find a way through this crisis. This is one of my favorite examples from Liège in Belgium, where the transition group in Liège came up with a question of what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Such a beautiful question. They created this project called the Liège Food Belt. I went there in 2014. It was just an idea. I went back in 2018. They'd started 27 new cooperatives, raised 5 million euros from the people of the city, not from the banks. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, 4 shops in the center of the city, this whole kind of network of cooperatives reimagining the food system of Liège. This is now a model which is being used to reimagine how the schools, the hospitals, the universities supply the food. The municipality came along and said, "This is great. How can we help?" Not how can we take this over? How can we help? Where are the blockages? Point them out. We'll get rid of them. And it's now a model which is spreading across Belgium to 6 other cities. It's spreading into France as well. This is the future, but it started with a really good what if question. And we need to get much better, I think, at asking a good what if questions. And the last piece is what I call pacts, which is an idea that came from Bologna in Italy. This is where this photograph comes from. So in Bologna in Italy, the municipality realized in 2012 that there was a real decline in people being involved in local democracy, people participating, people voting. So they started something they called a civic imagination office. I love it. Not a civic engagement office or something. It was a civic imagination office. They opened 6 laboratories around the city in different places. And then they would run big, really well facilitated visioning exercises like this. The smart piece was that at the end, when people came up with a good idea, the municipality would say, "That's a good idea. Let's make that happen." And in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts between the people and the community, between the people and the municipality in Bologna. And what I love about it is that on the very rare occasions we're invited to be imaginative in some kind of consultation or something, we go along, we write our ideas down. It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't impact anything. And then things just carry on as they were. So our imagination after a while just sort of shrinks and kind of gives up. What I love with this model is that it creates a kind of a drawing up of imagination where people can say, well, we imagined that and now it exists. What else could we do? We need to be doing that. We need to be creating those pacts where every time we ask people to be imaginative, we need to commit to helping make those imaginings actually happen, because that's how we start to build the imaginative muscle in our society. So just to finish off, the transition movement is something that I was one of the people who started, and the idea of the transition movement, and there are many transition groups in Brazil and in 50 other countries around the world. The idea is, what can you do where you are now? What can you do in your community, with the people you have, the resources you have? There's a great transition network in Brazil, which is there to help and support what you do. And what those groups do range from small things like planting some fruit trees, running workshops, up to really ambitious things like they're doing in Liège, community energy companies, community art projects, local currencies, all sorts of different things. But they start with people like you in the place where you are, daring to dream bigger and committing to actually doing something about it. Mariame Kaba, who I mentioned earlier, once said, "We must imagine while we build, always both." And that's really what's fundamental to the transition approach and to the transition model. And it's been an experiment now for 15 years of people self-organizing, not waiting for permission, not waiting for funding, just getting on and doing it. And so there's a huge amount of learning and resources there, which I think you'd find really useful. So thank you so much for being invited to share something at the Possible Futures Festival. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I don't fly. I stopped flying in 2006 as a climate activist. I feel like it's really the only thing that I can do, and in that regard. So I hope this has worked for you, my presenting like this. But I've probably saved about 8 tons of carbon, and we need to very rapidly move to a world where on average we use 2 a year. So it doesn't really justify to use 4 years worth of carbon to come when I can just do it like this. And hopefully it has worked just as well for you as a way of presenting some of these ideas. And I just wanted to finish by saying about a quote that I love from Arundhati Roy, the Indian novelist and activist, who said, "What lies ahead? Reimagining the world. Only that." So I hope there's been some ideas here that you find useful. If you want to find out anything else about me and what I do, robhopkins.net is that. And if you want to find out anything else about the transition movement, there's lots of resources, including a link to the Brazilian transition movement at transitionnetwork.org. And I also do a podcast every couple of weeks called From What If to What Next. So enjoy the rest of the Possible Futures Festival. Thank you so much for inviting me to present, and see you again. See you next time.